Hello, and welcome to the fifth chapter of the course. In this chapter, we will be looking at how we are supposed to respond against opens and jumps when we are the covering stack. For the spots we're going to see, we will again use the same tournament example that we've been using so far. So again, this is a $530 buy-in PSKO tournament. It is a 25K starting stack. The big blind currently is 500. So a starting stack would be about 50 big blinds. And yeah, everyone has the starting stack, which is $250 with 125 on their head, since it's a 50% PKO. To show you better in ships. So yeah, we can see 500 is a big blind and the starting stack was 25K. We are very early on in this tournament. So a starting bounty is worth about 1/4 of a starting stack, which is about 7K chips, or 6.5K chips, I guess, is more accurate. Okay, so as I said, the topic of this chapter is how do we respond to opens when we are the covering stack. So for that, what we're going to do is examine how we're supposed to play when money opens. This will be the first scenario we look at, and we will adjust it a bit and then look at some different positions as well. Okay, so money opens, and as we saw on the previous chapter, he is supposed to be opening a pretty tight range. And yeah, his bounty is worth about, as I said, 13 big blinds, something around that. So a very big portion of his stack. So therefore, money just cannot open wide at all. How are players behind supposed to react? Well, here we have one of the most common scenarios in PSKOs where I think people are misplaying quite a bit. So what we have happening here is that the players behind mostly want to call and not really 3-bet a lot. For the opening range, I just locked the response from the previous sim. I didn't want to spend more time running this. Yes, what we have is a lot of calling, as said. MP, for example, we can see is supposed to 3-bet almost nothing. 3-betting ace-king and then some frequency of the highest overpairs. But basically doing a lot of calling and calling a really wide range as well. Hijack does the same. Even though Hijack has 44 big blinds, we can see there is very, very little amount of 3-betting. And again, just calling very, very wide. This is the most usual response to a short stack open. The big stacks don't really want to 3-bet much. They instead want to go for a very call-heavy strategy. Now, why does that happen? Well, the reason is twofold. On one hand, we want to protect our range from squeezes from other stacks behind. For example, if we were 3-betting all of our value, then we would no longer be able to call hands like 5-4 suited or like 9-7 suited and so on, simply because our opponent would be able to squeeze almost any 2 cards profitably against us. So one reason is that we are calling a lot of our top range because we also want to be calling a lot of these suited connected hands. So therefore, we need to protect our range. The second reason is that we also want to trap stacks behind. Because we are also calling many weak hands, the other stacks behind are very incentivized to squeeze very linearly for value. Therefore, us having strong hands in our calling range is super important and just makes a lot of money. And again, this will almost always be the case. So the covering stack ends up calling a lot, not 3-betting. So we can see Hijack is calling, the cutoff is calling as well. The cutoff is also the biggest stack size from those left. We can see money has 27, cutoff has 57, and everyone behind has less than that. So even though the cutoff is covering everyone behind, still there is very, very little 3-betting. It's a super wide calling range, and this is again something that we see very commonly. When the big stack covers everyone behind, he gets to call a very, very wide range. So we see hands like Queen 4 suited, we see King 2 suited, we see 10-6, 8-5, 7-4, 5-3 suited. Basically, a really, really wide range, even 10-9 off is calling. We want to be calling these kind of hands because they just flop fairly well, and we just want to make a hand against this short stack that opens because his bounty is very important. So us flopping a flush draw or a straight draw or something like that is just really, really good. As for the remaining stacks, so the button, who is the other short stack with 21 big blinds, the button cannot call wide at all. And the reason is that the 2 blinds behind are fairly big stacks, so they will just attack the open and the call very, very aggressively. So the button's equity realization is very low with the calls. For example, after the button calls, we can see that the big blind is supposed to jam like 1/3 of his range. And this is after the button calls. So we can see pretty clearly that it's just not really possible for the button to call wide. I mean, the button doesn't even cover to begin with. So very, very different strategy for the short stack on the button compared to the other positions. How does the big blind react against this kind of open? So the big blind wants to call really, really wide. This is something that we again see very, very often. When the stack on the big blind is covering the opener in the PSKO, the defending range is just extremely wide and we don't really see many falls at all. Of course, as always, it depends on how relevant the bounty is to the whole thing. In this case, the bounty we said is about 13 blinds out of 27, so it's really big in comparison to the opening stack. So the big blind just gets to defend super, super wide. And in terms of jumps, it's mostly going to be pocket pairs and has like ace queen, ace king offsuit, some of these suited Broadways. When we have someone calling that we cover, like for example, let's say the button called, then the players behind just get to VPIP very, very wide ranges. The small blind, you can see, gets to overcall all these suited hands, king deuce suited, suited queens, all those suited connected low cards that aren't dominated. And as we already said, the big blind just wants to jam like 1/3 of his range and fold basically 0 hands pre-flop. This might come as a shock to some of you, but this is just how PSKOs work. Covering means that you want to VPIP a very wide range of hands and try to make hand to stack our opponent off. Okay, so we looked at how players behind are supposed to call to react against under the gun. Now, what about overcalling? I think that is another very interesting thing to look at. So we have under the gun opening, and then we have hijack calling. How does the cutoff get to react against that? Just as a reminder, the hijack has 44 big blinds, whereas the cutoff has 57. So the cutoff covers the hijack and everyone else behind. And in this case, you might be thinking that the cutoff gets to squeeze a lot, but the answer is still no. The cutoff just gets to overcall really, really wide. And thinking about this, both the opening range, which is already very tight, and the calling range, which is uncapped and has, as we saw, a lot of these like aces, kings, queens in it, some like ace, king suited, ace, queen suited. So both the opening range and the calling range have many very strong hands in it. Therefore, the cutoff just doesn't get to 3-bet that much in terms of value hands. And we can see, again, the same reasons that applied before apply here too, in terms of calling some of these super strong hands to protect the weaker hands we want to be calling. So even though the cutoff covers everyone, he does not get to 3-bet a lot. Instead, just opts to go for a very overcall heavy strategy. If we look at the other stacks behind, so small blind gets to jam a decent amount. The reason being that small blind covers both the opener and the hijack. Of course, he's covered by the cutoff, but the cutoff range is also the weakest of the three. So it's not as big of a concern. So we can see a very linear looking range for the small blind, jamming ace plus, all the suited Broadways, suited ace-x, ace queen off plus. And same is true for the big blind. So jamming this very linear range and not really folding much either. So very interesting mechanics here. And we just see that the concept or the perception that because we are the covering stack, we get to 3-bet a lot is just not true. When we are the covering stack in a bounty tournament, what we do is we call a lot. We don't 3-bet a lot. This is wired differently in a lot of people's minds, but we need to move past that. We need to stop thinking that, yeah, because we cover, we get to play very aggressively. No, we do not. That's not how it works. Okay, so now we looked at how we're supposed to play when the opener has 27 big blinds, 26.6. Now, what if the opener was a bit shorter and also of a bit later position? So for that, we can move on to the button. So in our example here, the button has 20 big blinds, 21. So if it falls to him, we saw how he's supposed to play, but how are the players behind supposed to react against the open? Right. So first, looking at the proper GTO strategy, where, as we said, the button just gets to limp a lot and play with some jumps. So against the limp, the small blind gets to isolate a very linear looking range and basically just doesn't really get to raise fold almost anything. Whereas the big blind doesn't get to have almost any non-all-in raises and just plays jams against the limp. We can again see that both the small blinds and the big blinds range look almost identical. And that's because even though the small blind isn't jamming, he's never folding against the button jam. Also, the ranges look very, very linear. We don't see much like polar blocker kind of jamming. We just jam our strongest top 33% of hands, basically. Okay, so what if the button had 30 big blinds instead of having 21? What if the button goes deeper? At 30 big blinds, the button is again supposed to have a bunch of limps, no jams, and some opens. So we can see that limping is by far the most common part of their strategy. And against the limp, when the button has 30 big blinds, the strategies don't really change. We again see the small blind isolating a very linear kind of range, and the big blind jamming a bunch, and at this stack size also having some non-all-in raises. Against the open from the button now, we have some fairly interesting mechanics. First, the small blind gets to call super wide against the open. We can see a very wide range of suited hands like Queen 2 suited, Jack 5, 7, 4, 8, 5, and also a lot of offsuit like 10, 9 off, Jack 9 off, King 9 off, all of these offsuit A6, offsuit broadways. So definitely a way, way wider range than it would be in a normal vanilla tournament. In terms of 3-bet calling, again, fairly linear and not doing much bluffing. I guess this ace deuce off would be our, ace 3 off would be our main bluffs. So if the button jams, then yeah, we just get to fold this offsuit A6 and that's it. This is our bluff, this offsuit A6. The big blind here plays a very interesting strategy, which consists of very little jamming. The reason behind that is if we look at the button's raising range, it's mostly going to be very strong hands or the weakest kind of hand that the button has. So we can see it's either like kings, aces, ace-king suited, ace-queen suited, or it's going to be like king 8 off, queen 9 off, this kind of hands. All of the middling hands from the button's range mostly want to limp, right? It's like Jack 10 suited, Queen 10 suited, King 8 suited, King 9 suited. The middling part of the button's range is limping. So the raising part is very, very polar. And against polar ranges, what do? We do not jam. We call. And we can see this portrayed very, very clearly here. So the big blind against the open jumps only 7.9%. So basically pocket pair, ace jack off, ace queen off, and gets a 3-bet non-all in a little bit as well, with top range and some really bad one high card, one low card hands. However, one thing you might say is that, but my opponents don't limp from the button. And I agree with you. Our opponents don't really limp much. So I also run this spot with the button having a raise-only strategy and no limps. First, one thing that we can notice is that because of that, the button has to play way tighter. With the limps, he can VPIP 48% of the hands and only fold 52%. Whereas with raises only, he has to fold 62.5%. So he has to fold about 10% more hands. Now, one other thing that changes here is that once the button opens, there is a lot more jamming against this type of range. First, the small blind, we can see jumps a lot more and 3-bets less. And also the big blind. Now the big blind doesn't really have many non-all-in 3-bets and instead jumps a much wider range. You can see the big blind is jamming about 7.8% in the proper strategy, and when it's raise only, the big blind is jamming over 20%. So we have a really, really big difference in the big blind's range when our opponents play no limps. And again, the reason for that is that now that it's raising only, the raising range isn't polar, it's very linear. So we want to be jamming and denying equity from like King Jack off and Jack 10 suited and King 8 suited and this type of hands. It is very important for us to know how our opponents play these spots, whether they have limps or whether they play raises only, and adjust accordingly. Okay, so next up, I also wanted to run this same spot with the button having 40 big blinds and a bigger bounty. So instead of him having his 20 big blind starting bounty or 30 big blind starting bounty, the example we just saw, he's going to have 40 big blinds and 1.5 starting bounties. So when we look at that, his opening range seems very similar to before. And we need to remember that it's all about how does the bounty translate into chips in comparison to his stack size. Even though now the button has a bigger stack, his bounty is also bigger, so the effective stack size of the button is almost the same as before. And we can see this in the opening range. He folds 60%, whereas at 30 big blinds and 1 starting bounty, he was folding 62%. The responses from the blinds are also going to look fairly similar. So small blind, 3-betting a bunch of hands like this and jamming the pocket pairs. With the big blind, playing a range like this, which again jumps fairly wide and not that much normal in 3-bet. Right, now I also want to examine a few more scenarios here. One of the scenarios that I want to look at is what happens when we play the big stack against a middle stack. So we're going to look at this scenario over here, which basically assumes that the cutoff has a stack size that looks like this, around 50 big blinds, and the button is covering. And we still assume that the blinds have the stack they do. So the cutoff has like 50 big blinds, and the button has 80, and these guys have still their like 50-ish big blind stacks. I changed them a little bit so that the small blind covers the cutoff, but the big blind doesn't. Just to show you the complete stack distribution, you can see here, cutoff has 50 big blinds, button has 80, small blind has 51.5, and the big blind has 47. So they're all middling stacks. The small blind covers the cutoff, the big blind doesn't cover the cutoff, and the button covers everyone. So the cutoff opens, and how does the button get to play against that? This is a bit of a different spot than the ones we saw before, because we just won't really have many jumps or anything like that. Okay, so cutoff is opening about the 37.6% range, which is very close to what the cutoff would open in a GPV situation. By saying GPV, I mean normal, not bounded tournament. Against the open, the button gets to play like this. So we notice immediately a few differences compared to a non-PKO tournament. Now, what are the differences? Well, first of all, the calling range is greatly expanded. We have a lot of suited hands that are in here usually, like Queen Deuce, Queen 3 suited, Jack 6 suited, these low suited stuff, like A7 off, even some like 10-9 off. So a lot more hands. The second thing that we notice is that the 3-bet range composition has changed. We still get to 3-bet about the same frequency we would in a non-PKO tournament, but with 3-bet slightly weaker hands. If we compare response to a non-PKO tournament, we can see that we 3-bet some like ace 8 off, ace 9 off. We 3-bet a bunch of suited aces, for example. Whereas now, you can see that we 3-bet ace 5 off, ace 7 off, so a bit worse. And we 3-bet a lot of suited jacks, suited queens, and not suited aces. So basically, our 3-bets are almost the same frequency. So here we 3-bet 12.6, and we 3-bet 10.4 in a normal GPV situation, a non-PKO situation. So the frequencies are very close, but our bluffing range moves 1 pip lower than where it would be in a non-PKO tournament. We don't want to be 3-bet folding such strong hands like a suited ace if the cutoff ends up jamming on us. So, yeah, I think definitely something to keep an eye out. We get to call a lot, and we get to 3-bet more polar, 3-bet worse hands than before. Now, after the button calls, it's also interesting to have a look at how does the small blind play. So remember, the small blind covers the cutoff, so it's still like a big stack compared to the cutoff, but is covered by the button. And the way the small blind reacts is that he gets to call a very wide range. Again, on one hand, we cover the cutoff, and on the other hand, the button is already calling a very wide range. We saw the button calling like 5-3 suited and 8-5 suited and Queen Deuce suited. So because we cover one and the other guy is very wide, from the small blind, we get to call a very wide range. We just overcall all of these suited hands. Also, we get to play very aggressively with our jams. And again, the thinking behind this is that we cover one and the other one is wide. So because of that, we just get to jam a lot of pocket pairs, suited broadways, ace jack off, ace queen off, ace king off. When we jam, the cutoff is calling like 8 plus ace jack suited, and the button is calling all pocket pairs, suited broadways, ace 10, king queen off. So they're supposed to call pretty wide, and we still get to profitably jam a lot of these hands. As a comparison, the big blind, who only has like 3 blinds less, gets to jam a much lower frequency because he doesn't cover the cutoff. So we can see that covering the initial raiser greatly affects our strategy. Small blind covers the opener by like 3 big blinds, so gets to play super aggressive with jams and 3-bets. Big blind does not, so gets to jam quite a bit less. We can see all these broadways, the big blind just calls them instead. Now, I would also like to change the scenario a little bit. So we keep the same stack size for the cutoff and the button. So the cutoff has like 48 and the button is covering with 80. But we change the stacks from the blinds. we have the small blind having 15 blinds and the big blind having 20. So basically, we want to look at how do we play as the covering stack when we cover the opener, who's a pretty big stack, and the blinds, the guys behind us are very short. So how do we play then? We still cover everyone, but the stack sizes are different now. Whereas in this scenario, we looked, the stack sizes were all very similar from the people we cover. Okay, so first thing, the cutoff is actually raising a much wider range because you can very comfortably call both of the blinds. You can see the cutoff's opening range has gone up to 52%. And then the way we play the button is that we play almost no 3-bets. This is very similar to the scenario we looked at before. And basically, we just get to call almost our entire range. The idea being that we want to play post-flop against the blinds and we want to allow them in the pot. We don't want to kick them out then. But then also, we at times just get to call in a 3-way all-in situation with super strong hands. So we don't really want to 3-bet many bluffs because, again, we don't want to kick the blinds out. And we don't want to 3-bet strong hands because we want to have one of the blinds jam and then the cutoff rejam. Again, very interesting spot and a very good concept for us to figure out and apply. When we are the big stack, we just don't 3-bet, as you can see. So after calling, small blind gets to jam a very wide linear range. And when the small blind jams, the cutoff gets to rejam a very big portion of his opening range. And that is the scenario we're basically looking for with our traps. We can see that in this spot, when the small blind has a fairly significant bounty and the cutoff jumps so wide, and we cover both from the bottom, we just get to call a ridiculously wide range. We will talk more about hands we want to have in 3-way all-in situations in a future chapter, but I just want to highlight the reason why we want to be calling here. We basically want to allow the short stacks behind to go all in. And of course, if the small blind jams and the cutoff folds, then from the bottom, we're calling our entire range because the odds we're getting are just way too good. Okay, now before wrapping this chapter up, I want to look at one more spot, which is basically how do we play as the covering stack when we face an open and a 3-bet. So in this example here, we're going to go back to money opening. We're going to move away from the bottom. And we're going to assume that money opens and then the hijack 3-bets. We said that the hijack isn't really supposed to 3-bet much to begin with, but it's not a 0% frequency. So under the gun one opens and hijack, as we said, doesn't 3-bet much, mostly calls, but still 3-bet sometimes. And the response to that for the cutoff is the covering stack. So money opens, hijack 3-bets, and how does the cutoff play? So the cutoff actually gets to call the 3-bet almost exclusively. There is very little getting it in with just queens and ace king. Everything else is just calling the 3-bet. So we get to call it with strong hands, of course, like aces, kings, ace king suited, and so on, but also with weaker hands like queen jack suited, jack 10 suited, king jack suited, ace jack suited. Why does it work like this? Well, because first, the hijack range is kind of strong, so we can't really get it in with, say, pocket nines here. We have the problem that the hijack's range is way too strong. And at the same time, we don't really want to fold them either because the EP opener will end up overcalling sometimes, and then we get to play post-flop when we cover both opponents and their boundaries are pretty significant. This is true in many, many examples in PKOs where when we're up against tight ranges and we face an open and a 3-bet, we just end up cold calling the 3-bet and not really getting it in. So yeah, we can see that the cutoff is just calling a lot. And not only when we're in position, but the small blind, who, by the way, the small blind again covers the hijack. So the small blind is playing a similar strategy. Well, not exactly similar, but still ends up calling some hands. Because because of being out of position, we can't really call as profitably, but we still see king jack suited, ace queen suited. These pocket pairs are interested in calling. The big blind, the same, because the big blind again covers the 3-bet or so the big blind gets to cold call the 3-bet quite a bit. So even though what we know from normal non-PKO tournaments is that we shouldn't really be cold calling 3-bets, this is not the case in PKOs. We end up having to call 3-bets, cold call 3-bets very, very often when we cover both players. Again, we need to keep in mind those key differences between playing a normal non-PKO tournament and a PKO tournament. Basically, I think the main takeaway from looking at how to play the big stack against opens and 3-bets and jumps and so on is that we just need to call a lot more. One final spot I want to look at is how do we play the covering stack when a short stack jumps. So for this example, we're going to look at the scenario we solved in the previous chapter where money has 5 big blinds, still starting bounty, but 5 big blinds. So we want to examine how do we play the stacks behind when the 5 big blind stack ends up jamming. So it should be this one. Yeah. So we know he wants to jump pretty wide and he ends up jamming his 5 big blinds. And what's interesting is that from the earlier positions with many players behind, we basically don't get to have any 3-bets. So if we look at MP's response, who has 47, so he jumps 5 and MP has 47, MP gets to play calls only. 0 3-bets, 0 jumps, calling the entire continuing range. The reason behind that is that, again, we want to be able to call this all-in with a very wide range of hands. So in order for us to be able to call 9-8 suited, we also need to call pocket 10s. This is another super common occurrence and a very solid concept where when we have a very short stack jamming, we basically want to call our entire range and not really do much free betting. The later the position goes, the more we get to jam and the less we get to call. This mostly applies when we have many players behind. So when we go to the hijack, for example, now we can see a bunch more jamming. The cutoff who covers everyone, again, jumps a bunch of these hands. But still, we get to call a very, very wide range of hands and not do that much raising. I see a lot of people daily just go for huge jumps with hands here. And what this means is that, sure, jamming ace-queen when you are MP, if you are Evil Smile, and money jumps 5, and you rejump ace-queen, it's not a losing play for sure. But then the problem comes that you actually cannot be calling these weaker kind of hands without being super exploitable. And should we care about being exploitable? Well, I think in these kind of spots, it's going to be fairly easy for our opponent to take a note and know that we're just not calling enough strong hands in this spot. I know I do that, and I think it's fairly easy for a lot of our opponents to be doing that as well. Again, this happens when the all-in person is super short. When the all-in person stack size goes up, for example, if money, instead of having 5 big blinds, but we said goes to 10 big blinds. Again, it's a spot we looked at in the previous chapter. When he goes to 10 big blinds and he jumps, oops, I opened the wrong one. I want to open this one. So 10 big blinds and he jumps, then we don't really do much calling at all behind. We mostly just play rejumps from every position. And the reason is that there just isn't enough room for us to have calls, but then fold. So he jumps 10 big blinds and his bound is worth about 13, as we said. So we can't really call 10 out of, say, 47 and then fold the rest against a reasonably wide range that's going to rejump on us. So this thing where we call our entire range only happens when the all-in stack size is very, very small. So that we have a lot of hands that can call once and then fold against future aggression. Now, finally, back to the 5 big blind example where here we are, where money jumps 5 big blinds. Let's say MP calls. How do the players behind act? And the answer is that there is a lot of overcalling. Similarly to before, because MP's cold call range to the 5 big blind jump has many nutted hands in it, there just isn't that much aggression. For example, the cutoff's response to the 5 big blind jump and MP's cold call is to play like this. So very little jamming and, again, mostly calling this super wide range. Same is true for example, the small blind and so on. We see this time and time again on example over example that we just want to be calling as the big stack. We don't want to be playing very aggressively because then we just cannot VPIP as much as we should. If we start jamming, say, ace-jack and, say, ace-queen and like all these hands, like 7, 6s, ace-jack suited, then the problem is that we can't call 8-5 suited against the jam and the call because our calling range will just be too weak. Okay, so hopefully you enjoyed this chapter and you learned something new. I think we saw a lot of very interesting concepts and mechanics of PKOs when we cover. And it's definitely an area where a lot of the population is still misplaying quite a bit. Hopefully that's not going to be you anymore after this chapter. And now, in the next chapter, we're going to look at how to play against opens and jumps when we are the cover stack, so the opposite from now.